They were the chosen few, the elite test pilots of the 1950s and 60s, who possessed what author Tom Wolfe famously called the right stuff. They were men with nerves of steel, engineering minds, and an unshakable coolness under pressure. The original Mercury 7 astronauts were presented to the world as modern-day knights, clean-cut American heroes embarking on a mythic quest to conquer the heavens. The public saw them as infallible, almost superhuman figures, the very best that America had to offer. But in the lonely, terrifying void of space, strapped into tiny capsules thousands of miles from home, these men saw things that challenged their understanding of the universe, things that were not in their flight plans or their engineering manuals. They encountered phenomena that shook them to their core, and according to some of the most credible astronauts to ever fly, they were later debriefed, dismissed, and quietly ordered to stay silent about what they had really seen orbiting the Earth. The story of strange encounters in space begins with America's very first orbital flight. On February 20th, 1962, John Glenn, aboard the Friendship 7 capsule, became the first American to circle the Earth. As he passed into his first sunrise in orbit, he radioed down to Mission Control with a report that was both beautiful and baffling. "I am in a big mass of very small particles that are brilliantly lit up like they're luminescent. I never saw anything like it. They're coming by the capsule and they look like little stars, a whole shower of them coming by." Glenn was mesmerized. He called them fireflies. For a moment, no one at NASA had an explanation. Was the capsule breaking apart? Was it some unknown space phenomenon? The mystery was eventually solved after another astronaut, Scott Carpenter, observed the same thing on the next flight and noticed that by tapping on the side of his capsule he could create more of them. NASA concluded the fireflies were simply tiny ice particles, frozen vapor from the capsule's life support systems, venting into space and catching the sunlight. It was a beautiful but ultimately mundane explanation. The incident set a precedent. Strange things happened in space, but they always had a rational, scientific answer. But as the space program progressed, some astronauts would encounter things that could not be so easily explained away. Of all the original astronauts, none was more respected for his piloting skill and cool-headedness than Gordon Cooper. An Air Force test pilot from Oklahoma, Cooper was a veteran of 2 spaceflights and one of the most outspoken and credible witnesses to the UFO phenomenon in history. But his experiences didn't start in space. They started years earlier, in the skies over the world's most famous flight test center. In 1957, while stationed at Edwards Air Force Base in California, Cooper was a project manager overseeing the installation of a new high-precision landing system. He and his camera crew were on the ground, filming landings, when a saucer-shaped metallic craft silently appeared in the sky. It hovered, then extended 3 landing legs and touched down on a dry lake bed just a few hundred feet away from them. Cooper and his men, all experienced pilots and engineers, stood in stunned silence. They filmed the entire event with 2 separate motion picture cameras. After a few moments, the craft lifted off vertically, without making a sound, and accelerated away at an incredible speed. Cooper, following protocol, immediately reported the incident to his superiors at the Pentagon. An officer from Washington, D.C. arrived shortly thereafter. The film was confiscated. Cooper was ordered to never speak of the incident again. The physical, photographic evidence of a UFO landing at a top-secret U.S. military base was buried, and the official story was that nothing had happened. Cooper would later say, "I had a camera crew filming the installation when this thing flew in. It was a classic saucer, shiny silver and smooth." The film was sent back to Washington and never seen again. This event was foundational. It proved to Cooper, years before he would join NASA, that UFOs were real and that the government was actively engaged in a cover-up. This knowledge would cast a long shadow over his own mysterious encounter in orbit. On May 15, 1963, Gordon Cooper blasted off on the final and longest flight of the Mercury program, a 22-orbit mission aboard the capsule he named Faith 7. On his final orbit, as he passed over Australia, he saw something that would become one of the most famous and controversial astronaut sightings of all time. He reported seeing a glowing greenish object that was rapidly approaching his capsule. Crucially, Cooper was not the only one who saw it. The Mouchia Tracking Station, a NASA facility near Perth, Australia, also detected the object, picking it up on their long-range radar. They confirmed that it was a solid object moving in an east-to-west trajectory, a path that was contrary to the orbital paths of all known man-made satellites at the time. The corroboration from a ground-based radar station elevated Cooper's sighting from a simple visual anomaly to a documented, instrument-verified event. The object paced his capsule for a time before accelerating away. When Cooper landed in the Pacific Ocean, his spacecraft was hoisted onto the deck of the recovery ship. He emerged as a national hero. But something strange happened immediately after his landing. According to Cooper, reporters who were on the ship to cover the event were explicitly told by NASA officials that they were forbidden from asking him any questions about the UFO sighting. Furthermore, the audio tapes from his mission, which would have contained his real-time description of the event, were not processed according to normal procedure. They were pulled, placed in a locked briefcase, and flown directly to Washington. Just like his film from Edwards Air Force Base 6 years earlier, the evidence had once again vanished into the black hole of national security. Gordon Cooper's testimony was explosive. A decorated astronaut, one of America's original heroes, claiming not only to have seen a UFO in orbit, but that the evidence was corroborated by radar and then immediately and deliberately covered up by his own government. He would spend the rest of his life speaking out about his experiences, convinced that humanity was being visited and that a powerful, secretive group within the government was hiding the truth. He was not the only astronaut who would have such an experience. As the space program moved into the more complex Gemini missions, another pilot would capture something equally baffling on film, providing the first photographic evidence of these mysterious orbital encounters. Gordon Cooper's explosive testimony established a disturbing precedent, the word of a hero astronaut, against the official denial of his own government. His story was powerful, but it relied on evidence, film and audio tapes that had been confiscated and hidden from public view. To truly challenge the official narrative of a sterile, empty space, researchers needed more than just testimony. They needed hard visual evidence that couldn't be locked away in a vault. That evidence would come during the next phase of America's journey to the moon, a series of missions that would push the boundaries of human spaceflight and capture some of the most controversial images in NASA's history. This was Project Gemini, and it would provide the first piece of photographic proof that our astronauts were encountering things in orbit that they simply could not explain. The man who would take that photograph was James McDivitt, the commander of the Gemini 4 mission in June of 1965. His mission was already historic. His crewmate, Ed White, had just successfully completed the first American spacewalk, a moment of national pride that was broadcast around the world. But on the second day of their mission, as they orbited high above the Pacific Ocean, McDivitt saw something outside his window that was not on any flight plan. It was, in his own words, a white, cylindrical object with a long arm or pole-like projection sticking out of it. It appeared to be relatively close to their capsule, and it was moving on a parallel course. As a trained test pilot, McDivitt's first instinct was to document the object. He scrambled to grab his Hasselblad still camera and a 16mm motion picture camera to capture the strange craft on film. In the cramped confines of the Gemini capsule, this was no easy task. He struggled to get the cameras powered on and aimed correctly, all while trying to keep the object in view. The lighting was difficult, and the object was moving. He radioed to his partner, Ed White, who was resting at the time, telling him to look out the window. But by the time White floated over to the viewport, the object had vanished from sight. McDivitt had managed to take several still photos and a few seconds of film. When he landed, the photos and film were, as was standard procedure, immediately taken by NASA for analysis. The photos, which have since been released, are undeniably intriguing. They are somewhat blurry and inconclusive, but they clearly show a distinct, white, cylindrical or tadpole-shaped object against the blackness of space. For a time, they were hailed as a potential smoking gun for UFO researchers. But the official explanation was soon to come. The Condon Committee, a controversial Air Force-funded study on UFOs, analyzed McDivitt's photos and released their official conclusion. He had simply photographed his own, jettisoned Titan II booster rocket. The case seemed closed, but there was one major problem. The pilot who took the picture vehemently disagreed. James McDivitt has stated consistently and forcefully for over 50 years that the object he saw was definitively not his booster rocket. As a pilot who had trained for years, he knew exactly what his booster looked like, what its flight path should be, and where it was in relation to his capsule. He has said in interviews, "I was a trained pilot and observer. I knew what the booster looked like. It was not the booster. It was a real object, it was a metallic object, and it was unidentified." He maintains to this day that he photographed a genuine, unidentified flying object. His refusal to accept the official explanation, his steadfast insistence as a credible, expert witness, keeps the mystery of Gemini 4 alive. He doesn't claim it was an alien spacecraft, but he is adamant that it was something unknown and something that was not his. As the space program transitioned from Earth orbit to the Moon with Project Apollo, the stakes became infinitely higher, and the culture of secrecy, many believe, became even more intense. We have already explored the strange case of the Apollo 11 bogey that paced the spacecraft on its way to the Moon. But the most explosive claims about what was really happening during the Apollo era would come from a man whose credibility was beyond question, a moonwalker. Dr. Edgar Mitchell was the lunar module pilot for the Apollo 14 mission in 1971. He was an MIT-educated Doctor of Science in Aeronautics and Astronautics, a decorated US Navy captain, and the sixth human being to walk on the surface of the Moon. And after he left NASA, he became the highest-ranking and most credible figure to ever publicly state that UFOs are real, and that the government has been covering it up for over 70 years. Mitchell's claims were different from those of Cooper or McDivitt. He never claimed to have personally seen a UFO during the Apollo 14 mission itself. Instead, he claimed that his unique position as a moonwalker and a military insider gave him access to individuals who were on the inside of the cover-up. After his return from the Moon, he began his own quiet investigation. He stated that he used his clearance and his status to speak with high-level sources within the military and intelligence communities. According to Mitchell, these sources, whose names he refused to reveal, confirmed to him in private briefings that the Roswell crash of 1947 was a real extraterrestrial event. They told him that the US government had been in possession of recovered non-human technology and even biologics, the bodies of the craft's occupants, ever since. Edgar Mitchell spent the rest of his life as an outspoken and unwavering advocate for government disclosure. He called the secrecy surrounding the issue a cosmic Watergate, a cover-up so profound and so tightly held that he believed that even some US presidents had been kept in the dark. He theorized that a secretive, quasi-governmental group was in charge of managing this incredible secret, hiding it not for malicious reasons, but because they feared public panic, religious upheaval, and were unable to control the technology they had recovered. The testimony of a man who had walked on the Moon, alleging a cosmic Watergate based on insider sources, elevated the entire UFO conversation. It was no longer a subject confined to the fringe. It was now a serious national security debate, championed by one of America's most decorated heroes. While the Gemini and Apollo astronauts had provided the most explosive claims up to that point, the phenomenon did not end when the Moon missions did. As America entered a new era of spaceflight with the reusable space shuttle, a new generation of astronauts armed with more advanced video cameras would capture some of the most baffling and controversial footage in the history of the space program. The explosive claims of moonwalker Edgar Mitchell, alleging a cosmic Watergate, brought the UFO conversation to a new level of public consciousness. His impeccable credentials forced even the most ardent skeptics to pause. But his testimony, like Gordon Cooper's before him, still relied on unseen insider sources and events that happened behind a thick veil of government secrecy. The Gemini and Apollo missions, for all their glory, were quick, targeted sprints into the cosmos. But as America entered the 1980s, a new era of spaceflight began, one that would allow for a more sustained human presence in orbit. The Space Shuttle was a reusable spaceplane, a workhorse that would make dozens of trips to low Earth orbit over 3 decades. These long-duration missions meant more time for observation, and crucially, they were equipped with more advanced color video cameras, often broadcasting live, unfiltered feeds back to Earth. This new technology would not only democratize the view from space, but it would also capture some of the most baffling and controversial footage in the history of the program, providing a new dynamic and highly debated form of evidence. This era also produced its own highly credible witnesses. Chief among them is Dr. Story Musgrave, a man who is arguably one of the most accomplished astronauts in history. A physician, a scientist with 6 academic degrees, and a veteran of 6 space shuttle flights, Musgrave spent more time in space than any of the original Mercury, Gemini, or Apollo astronauts. In interviews after his retirement from NASA, Musgrave spoke of his own deeply perplexing sighting. While in orbit on one of his missions, he witnessed something he still cannot explain. He described it as a long, white, snake-like or eel-like object moving through space in a way that defied simple explanation. In his own words, it had a serpentine motion. It was a living thing. It was organic. He observed it for a long period of time, trying to identify it as a piece of space debris or some other known phenomenon, but could not. He has been careful not to label it as extraterrestrial, but he is firm in his conviction that it was a genuine, deeply mysterious, unidentified flying object, something that appeared to have its own internal articulation and method of propulsion. The testimony of a 6-time space shuttle veteran, a man intimately familiar with the orbital environment, adds another powerful voice to the chorus of astronauts who have seen things they cannot explain. But Musgrave's testimony was just the beginning. The shuttle era's greatest contribution to the UFO phenomenon was the video footage itself. For the first time, anyone with a satellite dish and a VCR could record NASA's live television feeds, bypassing any potential censors. A global community of independent researchers began to spend thousands of hours poring over this footage, and they started finding things that NASA never mentioned in its official press conferences. To UFO researchers who analyzed the footage, this was an undeniable smoking gun. It looked, for all the world, like a ground-based energy weapon being fired at an extraterrestrial craft, which then takes intelligent, evasive action to escape. The incident was dubbed a shot across the bow, and it became one of the most famous pieces of UFO evidence ever captured. NASA, however, was quick to provide a more mundane explanation. They stated that the objects were simply small ice crystals and pieces of debris floating near the shuttle, illuminated by the sun. The bright flash, they claimed, was a routine firing of the shuttle's reaction control system, or RCS thrusters. The flash of the thruster, they argued, illuminated the ice particle, and the force of the gas pushed it away, creating the illusion of a sudden, rapid acceleration. For skeptics, this explanation was plausible, but for believers, it felt too convenient. Could an ice crystal really make such a sharp angular turn? And why did it look so much like an intelligent, evasive maneuver? An even more spectacular piece of footage would emerge 5 years later in 1996 during mission STS-75 on the Space Shuttle Columbia. This mission's primary goal was to deploy the Tethered Satellite System, a scientific satellite that would be unspooled from the shuttle on a 12-mile-long conducting tether. The experiment failed when the tether snapped. As the long, snake-like tether drifted away from the shuttle, NASA's cameras, zoomed in at high magnification, continued to film it against the backdrop of space. What they captured was astonishing. The footage shows what appears to be dozens, if not hundreds, of luminous disc-shaped pulsating objects swarming around the broken tether, seemingly investigating it. The objects move in a controlled, non-ballistic manner, appearing to fly in formation, and even move behind the tether, proving they were not simply lens flares or reflections. The footage was broadcast live, and it caused an immediate sensation. UFO researchers declared it to be the ultimate proof, a fleet of extraterrestrial craft caught on NASA's own cameras. The evidence seemed undeniable. But once again, NASA provided a scientific explanation. The UFOs, they stated, were nothing more than small ice crystals and pieces of shuttle debris floating relatively close to the camera. Because the camera was focused on the tether, miles in the distance, these nearby particles were thrown completely out of focus, causing them to appear as large, glowing, circular orbs. The pulsating effect, they claimed, was simply the camera's autofocus system hunting back and forth as it struggled to lock onto the tiny particles. It was a plausible scientific explanation, but again, it didn't satisfy everyone. The objects appeared to move with such purpose, their swarming behavior so organized that many found it difficult to believe it was just a random collection of floating ice. The evidence from the shuttle era was a paradox. On one hand, there was now hours of clear, undeniable video footage of strange objects in orbit. On the other hand, every single incident had an official scientific explanation. For skeptics, this proved the phenomenon was nothing more than misidentified space junk. But for believers, it pointed to something far more organized, a consistent and deliberate policy of obfuscation and denial. Why, they asked, would the government go to such lengths to explain away these sightings? The answer, according to insiders, lies in the very policy of secrecy established decades earlier, a policy that dictated that the truth, no matter how profound, must be kept from the public at all costs. The evidence from the space shuttle era presented a frustrating paradox. On one hand, the public now had access to hours of clear, undeniable video footage of strange objects exhibiting intelligent-seeming behavior in orbit. On the other hand, for every startling video, NASA provided a calm, scientific, and ultimately mundane explanation. It was always ice crystals, shuttle debris, or thruster firings. For skeptics, this was proof that the entire UFO phenomenon was simply a case of misidentification by untrained observers. But for a growing number of researchers, this consistent pattern of explanation, even for the most bizarre footage, was not proof of nothing but was in itself proof of a cover-up. It pointed to a deliberate, long-standing policy of obfuscation and denial. But it all begged one massive question: why? Why would the government and its space agency go to such extraordinary lengths to hide the most profound discovery in human history? The answer, according to insiders and unearthed documents, lies in a policy of secrecy that was established before the first American even reached orbit, a policy born out of a deep-seated fear of societal collapse. In 1960, a year before President Kennedy would commit the nation to landing on the moon, NASA commissioned a report from a highly respected think tank, the Brookings Institution. The goal was to study the potential long-term implications of the space program for human society. Buried within this report was a now infamous section that considered the potential consequences of discovering intelligent extraterrestrial life. The conclusions were not hopeful, they were apocalyptic. The report warned that such a discovery could have disintegrating effects on societies around the world. It predicted that religious institutions, many of which are built on a human-centric theology, could crumble. It warned that the scientific establishment itself could be thrown into crisis, its authority shattered. Most alarmingly, it suggested that if humanity were confronted with a civilization that was demonstrably older and more technologically advanced, it could lead to a global loss of purpose and a collapse of social structures. The report became, for many researchers, the foundational document explaining the motive for the cover-up. It established a cold paternalistic logic. Humanity was simply not ready for the truth. This Brookings doctrine, they argue, became the unwritten top-secret policy that dictated the official response for the next 50 years. This policy put the astronauts in an impossible position. These men were not just pilots. They were military officers, national heroes, and government employees, bound by strict oaths of national security and a profound sense of patriotic duty. If they were debriefed after a mission and told that what they saw was a matter of national security and must never be discussed publicly, they would have obeyed. To speak out would be to risk their careers, their reputations, their pensions, and to be branded as unstable, unreliable, or worse, unpatriotic. This is why Gordon Cooper's films and tapes vanished. It's why James McDivitt's photograph was officially dismissed. And it's why every strange video from the shuttle era was meticulously explained away. The astronauts were the first line of defense in a war to protect humanity from a truth it was deemed too fragile to handle. Men like Gordon Cooper, who chose to speak out later in life, did so at great personal risk, driven by a conviction that the public had a right to know. For decades, the stories of these astronauts existed in a gray area, dismissed by the mainstream as anecdotes and tall tales. But in the 21st century, the ground began to shift. In December of 2017, the New York Times published a bombshell report that revealed the existence of a secret multi-million-dollar Pentagon program to investigate UFOs, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, or AATIP. Along with the report, the Pentagon officially declassified and released 3 startling videos, captured by the gun cameras of Navy fighter pilots. These videos, known as Tic Tac, Gimbal, and Go Fast, showed objects that performed maneuvers that defied the known laws of physics, accelerating instantaneously, changing direction with no loss of speed, and moving seamlessly between the air and the sea. For the first time, the government was not just denying, it was admitting that its most highly trained observers were encountering objects in our airspace that they could not identify. This was a paradigm shift. The US government, after 70 years of denial, was finally starting to admit that the phenomenon was real. Public congressional hearings were held. A dedicated office, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, was established to investigate these UAP sightings. And then came the whistleblowers. High-ranking intelligence officials like David Grush came forward and testified under oath to Congress, alleging that the government has been running a decades-long illegal program to retrieve and reverse-engineer craft of non-human origin. This slow, steady drip of modern disclosure, this official acknowledgement that something strange is happening in our skies, is the ultimate vindication for the astronaut witnesses who have been silenced for over half a century. When viewed through this new lens of official disclosure, the historical accounts of the astronauts are no longer just strange anecdotes. They are crucial early data points in a long and consistent history of encounters. Gordon Cooper's glowing greenish object tracked on radar is no longer an isolated tale. It is an early Mercury-era example of the very same kind of transmedium object that Navy pilots are reporting today. James McDivitt's cylindrical object is no longer just a blurry photo. It's another piece of evidence in a long line of military encounters with unknown craft. And Edgar Mitchell's theory of a cosmic Watergate no longer sounds like a wild conspiracy. It sounds like a prescient description of the very secret retrieval programs that modern whistleblowers are now alleging under oath. The title of this story is, "This is the Evidence." The final evidence is not a single photo or a single video. It is the undeniable 50-year-long pattern of consistent, credible, and often corroborated testimony from the most elite and respected observers in human history. They were the first to go. They were the first to see. And they were the first to be silenced. The recent admissions from the Pentagon are not new revelations. They are the government finally, slowly, and reluctantly beginning to admit what our space pioneers have been trying to tell us all along. As Gordon Cooper himself testified before the United Nations in 1985, "I believe that these extraterrestrial vehicles and their crews are visiting this planet from other planets. For many years, I have lived with a secret, in a secrecy imposed on all specialists and astronauts. I can now reveal that every day in the USA, our radar instruments capture objects of form and composition unknown to us.